Welcome to the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction podcast. Today we're sharing two stories that have haunted me for a little while. Stories that have made me question the voices coming out of the TV or my speaker. It's made me a bit jumpy, to be honest. They make you question whether there's someone else lurking in the corner, and that is not a concept I am very happy about. So yeah, slightly scary episode today. You might know the feeling that when you're alone at night and you hear the music drifting from somewhere and you can't quite place it. Well, that's where today's podcast begins. Our first story, No Strings, comes from Ramsey Campbell, one of Lovecraft's heirs, but definitely a legend in his own right. He has spent 60 years proving that cosmic horror does not always need tentacles to destroy you. And a lot of the horror elements he uses include shadows lurking at the end of corridors or voices coming from a corner that you can't quite place. You might have seen that we celebrated Ramsey Campbell's 60th anniversary of his first publication last year, which is an enormous amount of time to be serving the horror genre, but it doesn't end there. We actually have a new book coming out from him this September called An Echo of Children, so that's for all the fans of Ramsey, or if you haven't heard any of his work before and you like this coming story, you might want to check out some other novels or some short stories. He has a lot, 60 years worth. Narrated by Nathan Chatelier, here is No Strings.
No Strings by Ramsey Campbell. Good night till tomorrow, Phil Linford said, having faded the signature tune of Linford Till Midnight up under his voice. And a special good night to anyone I've been alone with. As he removed his headphones, imitated by the reverse of himself in the dark beyond the inner window, he felt as if he was unburdening himself of all the voices he'd talked to during the previous 2 hours. They'd been discussing the homeless, whom most of the callers had insisted on describing as beggars or worse, until Linford had declared that he respected anyone who did their best to earn their keep, to feed themselves and their dependents. He hadn't intended to condemn those who only begged, if they were capable of nothing else, but several of his listeners did with increasing viciousness. After all that, the very last caller had hoped aloud that nobody homeless had been listening. Maybe Linford oughtn't to have responded that if they were homeless they wouldn't have anywhere to plug in a radio, but he always tried to end with a joke. There was no point in leaving listeners depressed. That wasn't the responsibility he was paid for. If he'd given them a chance to have their say and something to carry on chewing over, he'd done what was expected of him. If he weren't doing a good job, he wouldn't still be on the air. At least it wasn't television. At least he wasn't making people do no more than sit and gawk. As the second hand of the clock above the console fingered midnight, he faded out his tune and gave up the station to the national network. The news paced him as he walked through the station, killing lights. This year's second war, another famine, a seaboard devastated by a hurricane, a town buried by a volcano. No room for anything local. Not even the people who'd been missing for weeks or months. In the deserted newsroom, computer terminals presented their blank, bulging profiles to him. Beyond the unstaffed reception desk, a solitary call was flashing like a warning on the switchboard. Its glow and its insect clicking died as he padded across the plump carpet of the reception area. He was reaching for the electronic latch to let him into the street when he faltered. Beyond the glass door, on the second of the 3 concrete steps to the pavement, a man was seated with his back to him. Had he fallen asleep over the contents of his lap? He wore a black suit a size too large, above which peeked an inch of collar gleaming white as a vicar's beneath the neon streetlights, not an ensemble that benefited from being topped by a dark green baseball cap pulled as low as it would stretch on the bald neck. If he was waiting for anyone, it surely couldn't be Linford, who nonetheless felt as if it attracted the other somehow, perhaps by having left all the lights on while he was alone in the station. The news brought itself to an end with a droll anecdote about a music student who'd almost managed to sell a forged manuscript before the buyer had noticed the composer's name was spelled Beethoven, and Linford eased the door open. He was on the way to opening enough of a gap to sidle through into the stagnant July heat beneath the heavy clouds when early morning moods commenced with a rush of jaunty flourishes on a violin. At once, the figure on the steps jerked to his feet as though tugged by invisible strings and joined in. So, he was a busker, and the contents of his lap had been a violin and its bow, but the discovery wasn't the only reason why Linford pulled the door wide. The violinist wasn't merely imitating the Baroque solo from the radio. He was copying every nuance and intonation, an exact echo no more than a fraction of a second late. Linford felt as though he'd been selected to judge a talent show. "Hey, that's good," he said. "You ought—" He had barely finished speaking when the violinist dodged away with a movement that, whether intentionally or from inability, was less a dance than a series of head-to-toe wriggles that imparted a gypsy swaying to the violin and bow. Perhaps to blot out the interference Linford's voice represented, he began to play louder, though as sweetly as ever. He halted in the middle of the pedestrianised road, between the radio station and a department store lit up for the night. Linford stayed in the doorway until the broadcast melody gave way to the presenter's voice, then closed the door behind him, feeling it lock. "Well done," he called. "Listen, I wonder—" He could only assume the musician was unable to hear him for playing. No sooner had the melody ended than it recommenced while the player moved away, as though guided by his bunch of faint shadows that gave him the appearance of not quite owning up to the possession of several extra limbs. Linford was growing frustrated with the behaviour of someone he only wanted to help. "Excuse me," he said, loud enough for the plate glass across the street to fling his voice back at him. "If it's an audition you need, I can get you one. No strings, no commission." The repetition of the melody didn't falter, but the violinist halted in front of a window scattered with wire skeletons sporting flimsy clothes. When the player didn't turn to him, Linford followed. He knew talent when he heard it, and a local talent was meant to be the point of local radio. But he also didn't mind feeling like the newsman he'd been until he'd found he was better at chatting between his choices of music too old to be broadcast by anyone except him. Years of that had landed him the late-night phone-in, where he sometimes felt like he made less of a difference than he had in him. Now here was his chance to make one, and he wasn't about to object if putting the violinist on the air helped his reputation too, not when his contract was due for renewal. He was almost alongside the violinist, close enough to glimpse a twitching of the pale, smooth cheek, apparently in time with the mouthing that accompanied the music, when the other danced, if it could be called a dance, away from him. Unless he was mute, no, even if he was, Linford was determined to extract some sense from him. He supposed it was possible that the musician wasn't quite right in some way, but then it occurred to him that the man might already be employed and so not in need of being discovered. "Do you play with anyone?" he called at the top of his voice. That seemed to earn him a response. The violinist gestured ahead with his bow, so tersely that Linford heard no break in the music. If the gesture hadn't demonstrated that the player was going Linford's way, he might have sought clarification of whatever he was meant to have understood. Instead, he went after the musician, not running or even trotting, since he would have felt absurd, and so not managing to come within arm's length. The green glow of a window display, clothed dummies exhibiting price tags or challenging the passerby to guess their worth, their blank-eyed faces immobile and rudimentary as death masks moulded by a trainee, settled on the baseball cap as the player turned along the side street that led to the car park, and the cap appeared to glisten like moss. A quarter of a mile down the main road, Linford saw a police car crested with lights speed across a junction, the closest the traffic was allowed to approach. Of course, the police could drive anywhere they liked, and their cameras were perched on roofs. One of his late-night partners in conversation had declared that these days the cameras were the closest things to God. While Linford felt no immediate need of them, there was surely nothing wrong with knowing you were watched. Waving a hand in front of his face to ward off a raw smell the side street had enclosed, he strode after the musician. The street led directly into the car park, a patch of waste ground about 200 yards square, strewn with minor chunks of rubble, empty bottles, squashed cans. Only the exit barrier and the solitary presence of Linford's Peugeot indicated that the square did any work. Department stores backed onto its near side, and to its right were restaurants whose bins must be responsible for the wafts of a raw smell. To the left, a chain fence crowned with barbed wire protected a building site, while the far side was overlooked by 3 stories of derelict offices. The musician was prancing straight for these, beneath arc lights that set his intensified shadows scuttling around him. He reached the building as Linford came abreast of the car. Without emitting so much as a quaver from the rapid, eager melody, the violinist lifted one foot in a movement that suggested the climax of a dance and shoved the back door open. The long, brownish stick of the bow jerked up as though to beckon Linford. Before he had time to call out, if indeed he felt obliged to, he saw the player vanish into a narrow oblong black as turned earth. He rested a hand on the tepid roof of the car and told himself he'd done enough. If the musician was using the disused offices as a squat, he was unlikely to be alone, and perhaps his thinness was a symptom of addiction. The prospect of encountering a room full of drug addicts fell short of appealing to Linford. He was fishing out his keys when an abrupt silence filled the car park. The music, rendered hollow by the dark interior, had ceased in the midst of a phrase, but it hadn't entirely obscured a shrill cry from within, a cry Linford was too sure to be able to ignore it, for help. 5 minutes, less if he surprised himself by proving to be in a condition to run, would take him back to the radio station to call the police. The main street might even feature a phone booth that accepted coins rather than cards. Less than 5 minutes could be far too long for whoever needed help, and so Linford stalked across the car park, waving his arms at the officers as he raised his face to mouth for help at the featureless slate sky. He was hoping some policeman was observing him and would send reinforcements. He was hoping to hear a police car raise its voice on its way to him. He'd heard nothing but his own dwarfed, isolated footsteps by the time he reached the ajar door. Perhaps someone had planned to repaint it and given up early in the process. Those patches of old paint that weren't flaking were blistered. The largest blister had split open, and he saw an insect writhe into hiding inside the charred bulge as he dealt the door a slow kick to shove it wide. A short hall with 2 doors on each side led to a staircase that turned its back on itself halfway up. The widening glare from the car park pressed the darkness back towards the stairs, but only to thicken it on them and within the doorways. Since all the doors were open, he ventured as far as the nearest pair and peered quickly to either side of him. Random shapes of light were stranded near the windows, all of which were broken. The floorboards of both rooms weren't much less rubbly than the car park. In the room to his left, 2 rusty filing cabinets had been pulled fully open, though surely there could have been nothing to remove from them, let alone to put in. To his right, a single office desk was leaning on a broken leg and grimacing with both the black rectangles that used to contain drawers. Perhaps it was his tension that rendered these sights unpleasant, or perhaps it was the raw smell. His will to intervene was failing as he began to wonder if he'd really heard any sound except music. And then the cry was repeated above him. It could be a woman's voice or a man's grown shrill with terror, but there was no mistaking its words. "Help," it pleaded. "Oh, God." No more than a couple of streets away, a nightclub emitted music and loud voices, followed by an outburst of the slamming of car doors. The noises made Linford feel less alone. There must be at least one bouncer outside the nightclub within earshot of a yell. Perhaps that wasn't as reassuring as he allowed it to seem, but it let him advance to the foot of the stairs and shout into the dimness that was, after all, not quite dark. "Hello? What's happening up there? What's wrong?" His first word brought the others out with it. The more of them there were, the less sure he was how advisable they might be. They were met by utter silence, except for a creak of the lowest stair on which it tentatively stepped. He hadn't betrayed his presence, he told himself fiercely. Whoever was above him had already been aware of him, or there would have been no point to the cry for help. Nevertheless, once he seized the splintered banister, it was on tiptoe that he ran upstairs. He was turning the bend when an object almost tripped him, the musician's baseball cap. The banister emitted a groan not far short of vocal as he leaned on it to steady himself. The sound was answered by another cry of "help," or most of it, before the voice was muffled by a hand over the mouth. It came from a room at the far end of the corridor ahead. He was intensely aware of the moment, of scraps of light that clung like pale bats to the ceiling of the corridor, the rats' tails of the flexes that held sockets for light bulbs, the blackness of the doorways that put him in mind of holes in the ground, the knowledge that this was his last chance to retreat. Instead, he ran almost soundlessly up the stairs and past two rooms that a glance into each appeared to show were empty, save for rubble and broken glass. Before he came abreast of the further left-hand room, he knew it was where he had to go. For a moment, he thought someone had hung a sign on the door. It was a tattered office calendar dangling from a nail. Dates, some weeks apart, on it, the most recent almost a fortnight ago, were marked with ovals that in daytime might have looked more reddish. He was thinking that the marks couldn't be fingerprints since they contained no lines as he took a step into the room. A shape lay on the area of the floor least visited by daylight, under the window amid shards of glass. A ragged curtain tied at the neck covered all of it except the head, which was so large and bald and swollen it reminded him of the moon. The features appeared to be sinking into it. The unreadably shadowed eyes and gasping whitish lips could have passed for craters, and its nostrils were doing without a nose. Despite its baldness, it was a woman's head, since Linford distinguished the outline of breasts under the curtain. Indeed, enough bulk for an extra pair. The head wobbled upright to greet him, its scalp springing alight with the glare from the car park, and large hands whose white flesh was loose as oversized gloves groped out from beneath the curtain. He could see no nails on them. The foot he wasn't conscious of holding in midair trod on a fragile object he'd failed to notice, a violinist's bow. It snapped and pitched him forward to see more of the room. 4 desk drawers had been brought in, one to a corner. Each drawer contained a nest of newspapers and office scrap. Around the drawers were strewn crumpled sheets of music, strained dark as though, Linford thought and then tried not to, they had been employed to wipe mouths. Whatever had occurred had apparently involved the scattering about the bare floor of enough spare bows to equip a small string orchestra. By no means anxious to understand any of the contents of the room until he was well clear of it, Linford was backing away when the violin recommenced its dance behind him. He swung around and at once saw far too much. The violinist was as bald as the figure under the window, but despite the oddly temporary nature of the bland, smooth face, particularly around the nose, it was plain that the musician was female too. The long brown stick she was passing back and forth over the instrument had never been a bow, not that one would have made a difference, since the cracked violin was stringless. The perfect imitation of the broadcast melody was streaming out of her wide, toothless mouth, the interior of which was at least as white as the rest of her face. Despite her task, she managed to smile, though he sensed it wasn't for him, but about him. She was blocking the doorway, and the idea of going closer to her, to the smell of rawness, some of which was certainly emerging from her mouth, almost crushed his mind to nothing. He had to entice her away from the doorway, and he was struggling to will himself to retreat into the room, struggling to keep his back to it, when a voice cried, "Help!" It was the cry he'd come to find. Exactly the cry, and it was behind him in the room. He twisted half round and saw the shape under the window begin to cover her mouth, then let her hand fall. She must have decided there was no longer any reason to cut the repetition short. "Oh, God," she added, precisely as she had before, and rubbed her curtained stomach. It wasn't just a trick, it was as much of an imitation as the music had been. He had to make more of an effort than he could remember ever having used to swallow the sound the realization almost forced out of his mouth. For years, he'd earned his living by not letting there be more than a second of silence, but could staying absolutely quiet now save him? He was unable to think of what else to do, not that he was anything like sure of being capable of silence. "Help! Oh, God!" the curtain shape repeated, more of a demand now, and rubbed her stomach harder. The player dropped the violin and the other item, and before their clatter faded, she came at Linford with a writhing movement that might have been a jubilant dance, came just far enough to continue to block his escape. His lips trembled, his teeth chattered, and he couldn't suppress his words, however idiotic they might be. "My mistake, I only..." "My mistake, I only..." Several voices took up his protest at once, but he could see no mouths uttering it, only an agitation of the lower half of the curtain. Then 2 small forms crawled out from underneath, immediately followed by 2 more, all undisguised by any kind of covering. Their plump, white bodies seemed all the more worm-like for the incompleteness of the faces on the bald heads, no more than nostrils and greedily dilated mouths. Just the same, they wriggled straight to him, grabbing pointed fragments of glass. He saw the violinist press her hand over her ears, and thought that she felt some sympathy for him, until he grasped that she was ensuring she didn't have to imitate whatever sound he made. The window was his only chance now. If the creature beneath it was as helpless as she seemed, if he could bear to step over or on her so as to scream from the window for somebody out there to hear. But when he screamed, it was from the floor where, having expertly tripped him, the young were swarming up his legs, and he found he had no interest in the words he was screaming, especially when they were repeated in chorus to him.
That was No Strings by Ramsey Campbell, where reality and fiction blurs and a creature is born. Human-like, but without shame, without restraint, and without the social contracts to check one's all-consuming hunger. But what happens when that internal creature grows beyond our earthly boundaries? Our second tale is Lovecraft's Nyarlathotep from the anthology Endless Apocalypse. This master storyteller, who you might have heard of, takes this mirror self into cosmic territory and reveals creatures that aren't reflections of what we are, but what we might become when all of the human limitations fall away. I think the way that Lovecraft writes makes you think that these beings don't exist despite us. They exist because of us. Maybe that's what's most horrifying of all. So here's Nyarlathotep, narrated by our writer-in-residence, Shilpa Varma.
Nyarlathotep by H.P. Lovecraft. Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos. I'm the last. I'll tell the odient void. I do not recall distinctly when it began, but it was months ago. The general tension was horrible. To a season of political and social upheaval was added a strange and brooding apprehension of hideous physical danger, a danger widespread and all-embracing. Such a danger as may be imagined only in the most terrible phantasms of the night. I recall that the people went about with pale and worried faces and whispered warnings and prophecies which no one dared consciously repeat or acknowledge to himself that he had heard. A sense of monstrous guilt was upon the land, and out of the abysses between the stars swept chill currents that made men shiver in dark and lonely places. There was a demonic alteration in the sequence of the seasons. The autumn heat lingered fearsomely, and everyone felt that the world and perhaps the universe had passed from the control of known gods or forces to that of gods or forces which were unknown. And it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell, but he was of the old native blood and looked like a pharaoh. The Falahin knelt when they saw him, yet could not say why. He said he had risen up out of the blackness of 27 centuries, and that he had heard messages from places not on this planet. Into the lands of civilization came Nyarlathotep, swarthy, slender, and sinister, always buying strange instruments of glass and metal and combining them into instruments yet stranger. He spoke much of the sciences of electricity and psychology, and gave exhibitions of power which sent his spectators away speechless, yet which swelled his fame to exceeding magnitude. Men advised one another to see Nyarlathotep and shuddered. And where Nyarlathotep went, rest vanished. For the small hours were rent with the screams of nightmare. Never before had the screams of nightmare been such a public problem. Now, the wise men almost wished they could forbid sleep in the small hours, that the shrieks of cities might less horribly disturb the pale, pitying moon as it glimmered on green waters gliding under bridges, and old steeples crumbling against a sickly sky. I remember when Nyarlathotep came to my city. The great, the old, the terrible city of unnumbered crimes. My friend had told me of him and of the impelling fascination and allurement of his revelations, and I burned with eagerness to explore his uttermost mysteries. My friend said they were horrible and impressive beyond my most fevered imaginings. That what was thrown on a screen in the darkened room prophesied things none but Nyarlathotep dare prophesy, and that in the sputter of his sparks there was taken from men that which had never been taken before, yet which shewed only in the eyes. And I heard it hinted abroad that those who knew Nyarlathotep looked on sights which others saw not. It was in the hot autumn that I went through the night with the restless crowds to see Nyarlathotep. Through the stifling night and up the endless stairs into the choking room. And shadowed on a screen, I saw hooded forms amidst ruins and yellow, evil faces peering from behind fallen monuments. and I saw the world battling against blackness, against the waves of destruction from ultimate space, whirling, churning, struggling around the dimming, cooling sun. Then the sparks played amazingly around the heads of the spectators, and hair stood upon end, while shadows more grotesque than I can tell came out and squatted on the heads. And when I, who was colder and more scientific than the rest, mumbled a trembling protest about imposture and static electricity, Nyarlathotep drave us all out down the dizzy stairs into the damp, hot, deserted midnight streets. I screamed aloud that I was not afraid, that I never could be afraid, and others screamed with me for solace. We swore to one another that the city was exactly the same and still alive, and when the electric lights began to fade, we cursed the company over and over again and laughed at the queer faces we made. I believe we felt something coming down from the greenish moon, for when we began to depend on its light, we drifted into curious, involuntary marching formations and seemed to know our destinations, though we dared not think of them. Once we looked at the pavement and found the blocks loose and displaced by grass, with scarce a line of rusted metal to show where the tramways had run. And again we saw a tram car, lone, windowless, dilapidated, and almost on its side. When we gazed around the horizon, we could not find the third tower by the river, and noticed that the silhouette of the second tower was ragged at the top. Then we split up into narrow columns, each of which seemed drawn in a different direction. One disappeared in a narrow alley to the left, leaving only the echo of a shocking moan. Another filed down a weed-choked subway entrance, howling with a laughter that was mad. My own column was sucked toward the open country, and presently felt a chill which was not of the hot autumn. For as we stalked out on the dark moor, we beheld around us the hellish moon glitter of evil snows. Trackless, inexplicable snows swept asunder in one direction only, where lay a gulf all the blacker for its glittering walls. The column seemed very thin indeed as it plodded dreamily into the gulf. I lingered behind, for the black rift in the green-litten snow was frightful, and I thought I had heard the reverberations of a disquieting wail as my companions vanished. But my power to linger was slight. As if beckoned by those who had gone before, I half floated between the titanic snowdrifts, quivering and afraid, into the sightless vortex of the unimaginable. Screamingly sentient, dumbly delirious, only the gods that were can tell. A sickened, sensitive shadow, writhing in hands that are not hands, and whirled blindly past ghastly midnights of rotting creation, corpses of dead worlds with souls that were cities, charnel winds that brush the pallid stars and make them flicker low. Beyond the worlds, vague ghosts of monstrous things, half-seen columns of unsanctified temples that rest on nameless rocks beneath space and reach up to dizzy vacua above the spheres of light and darkness. And through this revolving graveyard of the universe, the muffled, maddening beating of drums and thin, monotonous whine of blasphemous flutes from inconceivable unlighted chambers beyond time. The detestable pounding and piping whereon to dance slowly, awkwardly, and absurdly the gigantic, tenebrous ultimate gods. the blind, voiceless, mindless gargoyles whose soul is Nyarlathotep.
That was Nyarlathotep. I'm very glad I don't have to say that word again. I hope you enjoyed our double dose of the supernatural. Sometimes I think hypernatural is a better word. They are us amplified, us without filters, us when we stop pretending we're civilized creatures who don't yearn for things that we can't name. Maybe they aren't invaders from outside reality. They are what crawls out when reality's restraints snap. So, here's my question for you. When was the last time that you felt like you were watching yourself from the outside? That moment when your own voice sounded foreign, when your reflection looked like a stranger? Have you ever had that out-of-body experience where you wondered who was really in control? Let us know in the comments, because maybe understanding these creatures starts with admitting that we've met them before, in the mirror.
Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction podcast. If you like this podcast, please remember to recommend it to a friend. Goodbye for now.